From Rangers, ended up at WPP, initially building image rights business around Pele, commercializing Pele's brand, which was pretty incredible for a kid who grew up in Ukraine. We live in a society where everything moves so quickly, right? So unless you are relevant, unless you have a way of maintaining that relevance, people just move on.
People want something that feels authentic in a world where everything is so polished and clean.
When you do it right, when you partner in a way where all the stakeholders bring value, then it's 1 + 1 = 5. I think that's amazing.
Hello and welcome to the Sports Pundit podcast, the show exclusively for the people shaping the future of sport. Driven by my curiosity working within the industry, I started this show to host conversations with decision makers from the MLB to the ICC, unpacking their strategies and industry shaping ideas. On today's episode, I'm joined by Misha Sher, Global Head of Sport, Entertainment and Culture at WPP. Misha has spent the last decade helping some of the world's biggest brands, from Toyota to eBay, connect with culture through sport. He's also worked directly with global icons like Pele, Vinicius Jr. and Mesut Özil, helping turn talent into brands that last far beyond the pitch. In this conversation, we explore what great sponsorship really looks like in 2025, how WPP works with both talent and brands, and why the future of sports partnership lies in cultural relevance, agile execution, and bold creativity. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Misha Sher. So thanks for joining me. We're here at SoccerX. You've just jumped off a panel. Maybe just to start with, you could give a little overview of yourself and your career journey to this point.
Sure, happy to. Well, originally from Ukraine, born and raised, so mention that because it's shaped a lot of my outlook on life, a lot of my interests. Growing up playing football, immigrated to US, you could say I failed, attempted playing professional football. After spending about 5 years in banking, I decided I want to get back into sport. It's what I love. That's where my passion was. So I went to Liverpool, did my MBA there, and actually started, ironically, at SoccerX. So 20 years ago. So it feels like a full circle moment being here. Spent a couple years at SoccerX building that business, growing it internationally to different formats and different continents. From there, I went to Rangers to run the commercial department there. And then from Rangers, ended up at WPP, initially building image rights business around Pele, commercializing Pele's brand, which was pretty incredible for a kid who grew up in Ukraine. And then the roles evolved into building a sports marketing business, sport and entertainment, gaming, talent marketing, and so on. So I guess it's the career spans really sports marketing, talent marketing across most continents now. We are.
You mentioned that first sort of role within sports being at SoccerX. What do you see I think from a foundation perspective, that's probably given you a huge advantage from a networking perspective, because at an early age, you was probably engaging with a lot of people that were maybe on panels or coming to speak or even just attending. What was the journey or the reason that you then moved into that Rangers job? Was there a connection or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was an amazing place in which to learn about the business as well, because it's not, and part of it is networking, definitely, because you're getting to meet the most senior decision makers, stakeholders, power brokers in what was the industry at the time. So whether that's leagues or federations or agencies or brands, the event brought all those people together. So you got to meet them, you got to develop relationships, but you also got to understand sort of the value ecosystem in the industry. So how are these companies and all these people interacting, and where do you sit, and how can you facilitate value across this sort of ecosystem? So, and what I learned, and I often talk about this when I speak at universities, is the power of building a really strong network and relationships, and getting to know people and offering as much value as you can at any moment in time. And so the reason I ended up at Rangers, because the relationship I had built with Alessia Russo, who, when I met him in year one, I think he was a marketing director at Hearts. And by the time, so he moved on through his career, went to KPR and eventually to Rangers. And when he ended up at Rangers, he called me and I was ready for the opportunity as well. It just sort of reminded me that a lot of times when people look at your career, they kind of think, they don't necessarily know why you move or how you move, but it's what you're doing at any given moment in time in your role and continuing to build your network and the relationships that could and often are the reason why you end up moving on because of the people that want to take you on the journey with them.
Yeah, my thoughts on it are like just consistently try and add as much value as you can and then broaden the surface area for luck to strike, right? So there's still an element of luck and still earned to a degree, but the more you can widen the opportunity for that luck to strike or for people to think of you when an opportunity arises, that's so much of it as well.
100%.
Like fast forwarding past Rangers, no offense to them, but to your work with Pele, because I'm curious, like he's probably one of the first athletes where there wasn't a sort of a focus on trying to commercialize everything around him. At least within football, maybe there were American athletes already at that point with sort of focused commercial strategies around them as individuals. But Pele is probably one of the earliest on the football side where a real brand has been developed around him. What what was it that you sort of took from that journey and you now maybe bring into conversations you're having with other athletes that you now represent through WPP and that wider group?
Well, I think what I realized with Pele is that nothing, you can't really take anything for granted. You would think that because Pele is such an iconic name, which he is, by the way, and what he's done for the game and what he's achieved and how he's admired and adored in so many parts of the world, it's hard to imagine another individual, bar maybe Nelson Mandela and Muhammad Ali, who are in that sphere. But what you realize, what I realized at the time, is that that doesn't translate into a brand that can be commercialized, right? There isn't, it's not, it doesn't happen just like that. It doesn't mean that you're just walking into rooms with some of the biggest companies in the world and they're saying, yes, absolutely, we want to partner with Pele and we want to run campaigns with him and we want to, we want to invest millions of dollars into these relationships. That is just not true at all. Right. So trying to articulate what is the Pele brand? What's the considering his global profile, considering the fact that he is a 70 at the time was a 72-year-old man, right? So what is it? Why, what's the relevance to what audience? And then as a result, to which companies and in which way can they potentially leverage a relationship with an icon like that? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be above the line advertising, although it can be. What is the strategy? How are we going to go about this? Because you could argue that you can go and talk to all the companies out there, but I think what I've realized through going through that process is, we're talking about one of the most iconic individuals. So what are the most iconic companies that are perhaps linked to have his longevity, are active in football or activating around Brazil World Cup or maybe involved in the Olympics. You start to sort of narrow it down across a number of different sort of criteria to make, to start to work out who are the potential partners that could see value in this. And then it's like, but what's the way in which they can leverage their relationship? It could be B2B, B2C, and so on. And then how do we extend that brand into licensing and film and entertainment and so on? So it was really a fascinating experience because I've never done that work before. So it's very fortunate to have landed the role at the time, but it was a blank canvas. It was just sitting down and trying to work all of that out. But what an incredible journey it was. What a phenomenal individual he was to work with. It really opened up my eyes to the world of athlete marketing. Yeah, it was incredible.
I mean, you talk about him being 72 at the time, so past his playing career at that point. What do you think some of the advantages and disadvantages are of working with a player that's already had their career? I guess from a legacy perspective, it's already nailed on. You know that he's had all of that success, but on the flip side, maybe less relevant and less visible from a day to day media cycle perspective.
I think it's increasingly much harder to do. I mean, Pele was probably an exception to the rule. You could look at some players like Beckham, obviously, but maybe it's not a good example. Like someone like Zidane, or there are very few athletes. And I can name a few others across other sports that still generate have the profile and the interest, many years past retirement without necessarily having to do, a great deal. Nowadays, we live in a society where everything moves so quickly. So unless you are relevant, unless you have a way of maintaining that relevance, people just move on. I see some of these iconic athletes, players from when I was growing up, and I see them at events or these Legends games, and you realize like these guys, I don't know, Del Piero or someone like that. I mean, these guys were unbelievable, incredible, some of the best players in the world. But if you ask yourself, like, how relevant are they today? How many people are really that interested in them? I don't know. So I think nowadays you really have to start thinking about that legacy during your career. You have to start thinking about this early on because the ability to build that relevance and build that brand will diminish significantly past your retirement. So while you're playing, when everyone's interested in you, when you have the ability to get into certain rooms and get in certain audience, that's the time to capitalize and to build a foundation on which you can then develop the next 30, 40 years of your post career.
I guess the common thread, even through you working at SoccerX and then landing a job at Rangers and then beyond that, is it's all about brand, right? Like at different levels of scale, but ultimately everyone has a brand, whether they like it or not. Is how you show up, how you add value, how you make people feel. How deliberate are you about that with your own career? And then what advice would you give to athletes that you're working with now, and maybe if there's any good examples out there of athletes that maybe haven't had the career of Pele, which is basically everyone, but have managed to create a very clear and distinct identity for themselves that has enabled them to maybe outperform when it comes to commercial opportunities and things like that.
Good question. Yeah, look, I think the most important word is being intentional when you're talking about building a brand, whether it's your personal brand in building your career or working with athletes, it's about what is it you want people to know and to think about when they think about you. I am quite intentional about things like that. I know what I'm good at and I know what I enjoy, and I'm intentional about wanting to be seen and be known for those things. So, for example, advocating for growth of women's sport is something I've been doing for many, many years. It's not something I've jumped on for instance, in over the last couple of years when we've seen all this media attention. No, I've been talking about this for many years, right? So I think if you were in the room in which I wasn't in, I'm willing to bet that that's one of the things that will come up is just sort of, is this advocacy and this interest and the work that I would have done in that space. Same with athlete marketing. It's a passion of mine. It's something that I'd like to think that I've got ideas and innovative ways of evolving. So whether that's thought leadership, speaking at universities, working with athletes, speaking on panels, those are the spaces in which I try to lean into. It's your brand is really what do people say when you're not around? I think ultimately that's the litmus test. When you're not in the room, what do people say? What are the two, three things that come to mind and what do you want them to think? So when you're developing your career, you should be thinking about that and trying to lean into those areas in any way that you can. Um, to your second question, I think there's been some really interesting examples in recent times of athletes doing this, and I'll go to a completely opposite side of Pele, but someone like Peter Crouch or Micah Richards, right? With respect, they've both had great careers, but they wouldn't be people that you necessarily would have picked to have a huge personal brand. They probably wouldn't have been top 10 people that come to mind, but they've really understood sort of what's special about them, the quirkiness, the humor, their take on things, the fact that people are looking for not just opinion, but entertainment and personality. And they have that. And it's not, again, I hate to use the word authentic, but that is authentic to them, right? So, and they've properly leaned into it. So you look at whether that's them ending up on CBS, like Micah Richards or Peter Crouch having his own podcast or them featuring in branded content and commercials, all of that is leveraging their personality, which they understood was different and unique in the world of, where you do need to show up in a different way. So I just think it shows you that you don't have to be one of the most iconic athletes who've won World Cups and Champions Leagues and all of that, or even have to have global appeal. It's just about really saying, hey, those guys understood what's special about them, where that can show up in the right way, in what, particularly in many instances, just in the country that they're from, and they've done that really, really well. So that's if they can do it, I think just shows you that you don't have to be a Pele to be successful in that.
I think the other interesting thing there, you mentioned Crouch having his own podcast. Another one that I would put in that same bucket is Ben Foster,
Yeah.
who's created a huge podcast and YouTube channel. And I think with both those examples, what's interesting is like previously with media, you needed permission, right? You needed to go on ESPN, you needed to go on CBS, you needed to go on Sky Sports. Whereas now it's permissionless, right? If you've got a brand or a narrative that you want to push to the world, you you have social media, so you can create your own channels and you can start to be very proactive about doing that even before anyone's asking you to do it, right? So Ben Foster at the time wouldn't have been someone that, again, I think he's playing in the championship when he started that channel and just started putting a GoPro in the goal. And I think unlike Crouch, who's I think maybe abnormally funny, right? Like he's a pretty funny guy. Like Ben Foster is entertaining, but I wouldn't say he's like a stand-up comedian, right? But he still managed to create a narrative and provide that sort of insight that people were craving that they maybe wasn't being provided by the traditional media. Another one in that bucket is Kitson, who was at Portsmouth, who had the secret footballer, right? And like he didn't even use his brand. He actually, it was more advantageous for him to take the personal brand away and use just the fact that he had that access. So there's like so many different ways to do it. But I'm curious if there's any athletes you're working with now that you think are doing a particularly good job when it comes to getting the word out there or like creating their own narratives in a good way.
I mean, look, um, one of those athletes is who soon to probably coming to the end of their career is Ali Riley at Angel City. The thing about Ali is she's been an incredibly successful footballer. She's played in 5 World Cups, 4 Olympic Games. It's been an incredible career. Now she's the captain of one of the highest profile women's sports team in the world. But what's interesting about Ali and the thing that she really gets is that she's got a very unique personality, right? So in the world of, in the world of women's sports, particularly in recent years, everything's been about sort of the fight, it's about sort of the equal pay or equal treatment. And it's all this sort of challenging sort of a lot of the narrative around the women's sport is all about sort of challenging the system. So, and rightly so. And you have people like Megan Rapinoe and others who are doing that. Ali brings a completely different light to this, to the world of women's sports. And she understood that, and she's hugely creative. And again, you talked to the point earlier. So this intermediation of media, she's been creating content, shows, and formats for like a long time on her mobile, right? So in the past year, she and her best friend Sydney LaRue, who's a teammate, created this show called BFFR, Best Friends for Real. They filmed it on their mobiles, right? And it took off to the point where they had multiple media companies bidding to basically take that show on and produce it, to produce it with them with minimum guarantees and everything else. So, and it's now being produced by Sinclair Media, which is one of the biggest media companies in the US. And again, what's interesting is like if you understand what makes you different, what makes you special, what's the best way to sort of bring that out? Now we have podcasts, we have other different types of formats, and you really lean into that. The audience wants to see it. The audience finds it refreshing. They find it entertaining. And I think she's doing that really, really well. And for me, it's interesting that this was literally started on a device that's in all of our pockets, right? So the ideation, the filming, the editing, and all of that started on a mobile phone, which has now become one of the fastest growing shows. I think last I checked on Spotify podcast. So that's just one example, but there are many others.
I think that also plays into this trend of user generated content over really shiny influencer content, right? Like people want something that feels authentic in a world where everything is so polished and clean. I'm sure from a brand perspective, there are brands that can really tie into that, right? Whether it's the Wingmen with Andy Robertson and Trent Alexander-Arnold is another one that comes to mind in a similar vein, right? Like they're really good friends. They're driving a car. Can you sponsor that with a drive-through? Can you sponsor that with a car company or a phone company because you're filming it on a phone, right? There's so many ways that you can actually authentically bring a brand in that can feel very additive to the moment and it belongs there. It doesn't feel out of place, which kind of brings us to the other half, right? Because you're working with athletes, but you're also working with brands within your role. So maybe we go from Ali to Ally, which is, I know, a big sponsor of women's sport in the US and a company that you have spoken about before. I'm curious to get your take on what brands are looking for when you're speaking to them or advising them, and then maybe how that ties in on the athlete side with partnerships.
Look, what brands are increasingly looking for, I mean, you speak about Ally, they're a great example, but they're looking to show up now in this world where everything's so saturated and commoditized. They want to show up in a way that is different and is distinctive and that is true to them than than anyone else, right? So I think that's where they feel like they're genuinely bringing value to the ecosystem in which they're investing, right? So let's be honest, women's sports still, as much as it's growing, still doesn't have the same profile, but Ally are doing something about this. They're going to say, "Look, we're going to invest in women's sport because we believe in it. We're going to feature that in our marketing. We're going to elevate the game, the athletes, the moments because we want to demonstrate that investing in women, is actually is just good for society. It's not even just about investing in NWSL. But if you speaking more broadly, that is the question that most brands are asking these days is like they say, look, it's so crowded. It's so crowded in that space. There's so many sponsors. What could be the way that we show up that can grab people's attention? That again, to the point I was making on the panel, that rewards people for their time rather than interrupting the experience, trying to maximize exposure, but coming at it from a perspective like, how can we partner with the athlete, with the property, or maybe with both, and to create something that creates stories ultimately that connect with people that we want to connect with. Because if you strip it all back, at the end of the day, the shortest distance between what all brands are trying to do is to connect with their consumers, right? So, and the shortest distance between the brand and the consumer is a story, right? So ultimately, it's what is the space for us to be playing in? How do we show up? What's the best way for us to tell stories that resonate with people that we want to connect with? And that, that influences our thinking in how we partner, who we partner with, how we partner with them, how we execute with them. Does the partnership allow us to show up in the way that we want to show up in? Unfortunately, in many instances, a lot of these deals are done without thinking all of that through, and you realize that actually what you're trying to do isn't really possible. And so you sort of you lose the opportunity to do that. But when you do it right, when you partner in a way where where all the stakeholders bring value, and then it's 1 + 1 = 5, and I think that's amazing.
You mentioned a brand partnering with potentially the property and an athlete. One example we spoke about kind of in preparation for this interview was Alessia Russo, Google and Arsenal. I'm curious if maybe you could provide a bit more insight into that partnership and maybe as well, like what has to be in place behind the scenes in order for something like that to be facilitated, right? So, like, actually bringing that to life.
Well, I think what's interesting about Alessia and Arsenal is that there is a very, very close relationship between. It's not just a player at the club, but there's a very close relationship between Alessia and the club as it relates to their building their brand and building their commercial activity, right? So their interests are aligned in that sense. So when we talk about partners, some of the club partners that Arsenal works with, JP Morgan being one or Google being another one, there's already a relationship that the club has with Alessia commercially that makes those conversations easier, right? They're both, the club wants to grow the women's game. Alessia wants to grow the women's game. Everybody wins if if a partner in that equation can come in and help to deliver that, can help to, as Google does through everything they're doing with Pixel, is all about elevating women's football and women's sport and making it more accessible, making it more visible through their devices. Then that's a win, that's a win-win-win rather than in other instances where those relationships are a lot more transactional, right? Where it's about going to the player, it's about seeing whether or not the fee is high enough or whether they're happy for deliverables. You have a genuine alignment of interests there, right? So, and that is fundamental to having any success. And, you know, Alessia is one of the club's highest profile players. She can accelerate what Pixel are trying to do Have seen that partnership discussion start and evolve. It's been great to see just how invested all the parties have been in building the story that is then going to be told over the course of the summer.
You mentioned Arsenal having a commercial interest in Alessia. Is there a way that they're structured, without giving away anything that's obviously confidential, but is there a way that Arsenal work with their athletes that allows them potentially like a more direct route to these kind of arrangements than other clubs?
Yeah, well, they're very forward thinking in that regard. They understand, and they've got a very progressive team. They understand what it will take to elevate, to sell more tickets, to bring more commercial partners, to build a bigger fan base. And they know that talent, especially high profile talent, can be a huge asset. And they build those relationships and they make sure that everyone in that equation is aligned, right? So the interests are aligned in terms of what they ultimately want to achieve. And if that's the foundation, you are onto something very successful as opposed to not having that sort of alignment and those relationships being quite transactional.
So we're just out of time now. So just to wrap things up, I was at the Sports Industry Awards, and I think two brands that you worked with quite closely in eBay and Toyota were both up for awards and both actually won. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about the work you've done with them and then what you kind of have lined up for the next kind of 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, eBay has been great. We've worked with eBay for so many years now, and it's amazing actually to have seen the journey for them as a brand, really leaning into culture, right? Showing up in different ways. We work with them in football. We work with them on television shows. This particular campaign was all around experiential. So, and it was about promoting their parts and accessories business because that is one of the biggest drivers of business for them is cars and parts and accessories. So we had these experiential spaces that we created with eBay across all these different motorsports events, culminating at Goodwood, right? Where people can see what a garage looks like and really simplify to the audience, like what this whole process around cars is, or fixing cars or working on cars and so on. Again, I just think oftentimes when you think about brands showing up now, it's like, what's the story? What's the relevance? Why there? Why is this interesting for the audience? And people just love the experience, right? So we're obviously showing up in places where you have car enthusiasts. And if you show up there and that's very on brand and it's interesting and engaging and drives, ultimately sort of drives, traffic to your business, then again, it's a win-win-win all around. So very proud of the team of what they've done there. And then turning to, Toyota, again, we've worked with Toyota for probably over 6 7 years now around the Olympics and Paralympic Games. And one of the biggest things that Toyota wanted to do was to become a mobility brand, right? So how are they actually utilizing their technology to make the society more mobile? And nowhere is that more relevant than when it comes to disability and helping people who have certain forms of physical disability to be more active and to be able to move. So the campaign that we created, with Team GB was all around Paralympics and creating a hub where people of all sorts of different disabilities can come to and can access activities, right? So again, I come back to what's the brand, what's the proposition, what's the value that you're, beyond the campaign. It's not just about saying, hey, we're all about mobility. It's about saying, hey, like we have pulled hundreds of thousands of people into this ecosystem, made them feel like they belong, gave them an opportunity to meet others, to engage, to get moving. I think I'm hugely proud of the team for doing that. We've got other really interesting work in progress now with Lexus and other clients. So yeah, it's exciting times. We've got Women's Euros this summer with Pixel, Coca-Cola we're doing work with as well. And you got Men's World Cup next year. So lots to look forward to.
Nice. I'm sure we'll have to have a follow-up conversation to keep this going. But thank you so much for your time today and appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Sports Pundit podcast. I'll include more info about the guest and the topics covered in the show notes. And you can also find my LinkedIn profile if you'd like to connect and let me know what you thought. Visit sportspundit.co to find previous editions of the podcast, access the newsletter, and to sign up for our WhatsApp group and see upcoming social events in cities around the world. See you again soon.